I'm Jeffrey Botkin, and I have a message for American gun owners. I've been watching the way gun owners have responded to the pronouncements of President Biden yesterday, his 6 new executive orders aimed at disarming civilian citizens over time. Now, the general response of gun owners that I've seen, talked to, and read about was almost indifferent. They yawned, and they scoffed at the apparent weakness of the orders. Now, and I guess what this says to me is that you think if it doesn't touch your guns today, you seem to think you dodged a bullet, and you can say, ha, you missed me, Biden. But I think you're missing the trajectory of the attack on you and your weapons. It wasn't his intent to take your guns this week. It was to eliminate the Second Amendment in the minds of the American public so that you can quite easily be disarmed over the next couple of years, even with really weak regulations like the ones that you're laughing at today. Biden's speeches on gun control hammered away at the Second Amendment for over 4 decades when he was in the Senate, when he was vice president, and he has been really successful in shifting American hearts and minds with all the emotional ways that he has been simply hammering away at this again and again and again, repeating the same lies over and over and over. And a really good summary of what most public educated Americans now believe was put into a soundbite yesterday by Biden's senior advisor, Cedric Richmond. Now here it is. Now note the mixture of truth and error that is in here. He said this: Republicans have hid behind the Second Amendment for far too long. And what he means by this is that the reason that we can't get guns out of the hands of people is because Republicans are stubborn, and they're hiding behind this Second Amendment, and they keep putting up fights so that we can't just go get rid of these guns that are in the hands of the civilian citizenry. Because, as they say, only policemen should have them, only the military should have them, only the National Guard should have them, right? And he goes on to say this: when the Second Amendment was written, people were stuffing gunpowder into a musket to shoot. Now, is that true? Yeah, that's a true statement. Happens to be true. Now, he says, you have guns that can shoot 100 rounds a minute. And that's just completely different. Okay, is that true? Well, yeah. 100 rounds per minute is very different from 3 rounds per minute. These are weapons of war, he says. Well, he's right. The muskets are weapons of war, and so are the AR-15s. They're weapons of mass destruction, he says. Is that true? Well, it is true if you're a good shot. If you're not, well, they can't just really destroy anything. Then he says this. So the statements that he's making are pretty true and accurate up to this point. And then he says they have no place on the streets of America. And why is that? Okay, so that is his conclusion. That's his therefore. So therefore, we can't have any high-cap magazines, no ghosty guns, no assault rifles, no accurate pistols, no ammo, and of course we can't have that old Amendment number 2 that's standing in the way of civilized gun control. And therefore, modern guns have no place on the streets of America. That's the message. Biden has been saying this. The people he's hiring to be his advisors are saying this. They learned it. The judges that he has trained and influenced over the years are saying the very same thing. And of course, the man that he wants to run the ATF is saying the very same thing. And so, this new definition of history that he has twisted enables Biden and his Department of Justice to say, and he said this yesterday in his speech, no amendment to the Constitution is absolute. Okay? Which means it's being burned up in right before your eyes if it's not absolute. If they take a vow and an oath to uphold and defend what's in the Constitution, but now we're saying it's not absolute, well, they can simply break it. And in the very same speech yesterday, he said this: nothing I am about to recommend in any way impinges on the Second Amendment. And how is that true? Well, it's true if he's totally redefined the Second Amendment to change it to mean exactly what he thinks he wants to say and what his ATF nominee, David Chipman, thinks he wants it to say. Here's one of his quotes. The Second Amendment envisions firearms as being well regulated, and individual sheriffs aren't entitled to decide whether a particular regulation is constitutional. That's the job of the courts. Well, This twists history in just one sentence in three very perverted ways. I'll just say that. Of course, if a sheriff has taken an oath to defend and support the Constitution, he does have a duty and an obligation to figure out if a law or a regulation or an injunction or whatever it is constitutional. He cannot go along with and support and enforce something that's not a real law or something that's not a constitutional principle or law. And this is where you American gun owners are in real trouble, and where your nation is in trouble. Your amendment is going down in flames because of the way it's being redefined, and so are all the other 9 major amendments of the Bill of Rights, including the 10th Amendment, including the First Amendment. Okay, when your free speech and my free speech is certainly being stolen away from us. Your guns will have no future protection once public opinion and the opinion of judges is on the side of the Biden definition of the Constitution. Cowardly legislatures, like we saw in the year 2020, will go along with this, just as they tolerated unlawful balloting practices and arbitrary medical regulations. You saw that. I saw that. They didn't have backbone because the average legislature does not know history or the text of the Constitution. Now, here's how you can change that. You need to refute the Biden machine with historical fact. And let me give you 14 facts just to get you in the fight. And you need to roll these out. You need to be talking about these. If you're serious about the Second Amendment, you need to start getting these into the minds of people and replacing what they have been told in public schools and in their universities and by the Biden machine over the last 40 years, starting with the year 1792. Okay? And we're going to work our way backwards because I want you to see where there's a connection between the Second Amendment as it was written and really 800 years of history, and why it's so wrong for anyone to come along and say, well, it's obsolete now because we don't have muskets anymore. No, there's our principles behind it that make it absolutely required that we hang on to it, protect it, and preserve it. So only a year after, look at this year now, only a year after the ratification of the Constitution and the Second Amendment, Congress passed legislation which strengthened, it even went beyond the Second Amendment. It strengthened the Second Amendment principles. The laws upheld that were passed then, 1792, upheld the tradition that civilian citizens must arm themselves with military weapons of war. These were the Militia Acts of 1792. And it said citizens are required by law to equip themselves with their own musket, their bayonet war belt, 2 spare flints, a box able to contain not less than 24 suitable cartridges, and a knapsack. I mean, this was the weaponry of the Minuteman. It was also the weaponry of the Redcoat, the infantrymen who invaded our country. I mean, we were using military weaponry to preserve our freedom. And in times of peace, citizens need this just in case a tyrannical ruler decides to steal freedom away also. This is military weaponry of destruction. And going back even before the Second Amendment, the American colonists spoke this language. They spoke this centuries-old language because it was a deep-running foundation of English common law. Look at the Virginia Colony Declaration of Rights. A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. Now look at this one, Pennsylvania, that colony's declaration of 1776. The people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. The North Carolina Colony Declaration. The people have a right to bear arms for the defense of the state. And so when a time comes to write the Second Amendment for the new American Constitution, they are used to these ideas in this language because they are rooted in reality and in history. The Massachusetts Colony Declaration of Rights in 1780. The people have a right to keep and bear arms for the common defense. Now look at this quote by a cavalry officer who fought with Washington, Henry Lee, who understood this and tried to summarize it in one little sentence. And this captures that very, very well. Every man capable of bearing arms And back then, as we will see as we go back in history, they believed that every man roughly aged 15 to 60 should be capable of training themselves in arms and bearing arms for the defense of their nation against intruders or against their own governments. So Henry Lee says this: every man capable of bearing arms must use them in aid or in opposition to the country of his birth. Okay, now how does that work? Well, if you have an invading army coming after you, all of your people are well trained in arms and they own all their own weaponry. They can gather together and they can repel the enemy. Or if a tyrant wants to seize control of all the people and all their goods and turn them back into slaves, then they have the ability then to rise up against him and depose him or replace him. Now, going back in history, 1644, Massachusetts colony law, as far back as that, every citizen is to provide for himself and each under him able to bear arms, a sufficient musket and other serviceable piece, as well as 2 pounds of powder and 10 pounds of bullets. Do you see how specific these things get? Yes, this is weaponry of war. These are weapons of mass destruction. When you get 1,000 men out there from your community who've trained together, and each of whom have all these things, they don't need to wait to be provided them by the government. They're ready to throw these over their shoulders and go out and face an enemy and defeat him. 1631 is a common law of the time. All men that are fitting are to bear arms and to bring their pieces to the church upon pain of every offense. And across the colonies, north to south, there were laws like these saying, you need to bring these to church on pain of every offense. There would be some sort of a punishment, usually a fine of tobacco or something. And what they would do in the afternoons after church was to drill, to practice, to get together and practice loading. I mean, you know, you could get to the point where you could stuff gunpowder into a musket 3 times every minute, and a musket ball, and fire accurately 3 times every minute. Look at the year 1541. And this is a law going back across the Atlantic into England. All inhabitants of cities and towns may have and keep in every one of their houses handguns, hagbutts, and demi-hakes. Okay, these are all weapons of mass destruction. These are all weapons of warfare, and they're to be in the hands of the citizens and in every home. They're military weapons of war. 1511, the weapons of war archery laws, and these changed quite a bit, but they were all consistent with the very same principle. All fathers were to provide their sons with appropriate bows and arrows and to teach them how to shoot the bows starting at age 7 and have these weapons in their home, right? 1363, the archery laws required practice of archery on Sundays and holy days and forbade on pain of death all sport that took up time better spent on war training, especially archery practice. So in some places of England, it was, you know, people were tempted to replace the serious things of responsible living and responsible preparation against potential enemies. And England had a lot of potential enemies because they were such a rich nation. And there were invaders all the time. And they knew that they should stay prepared and stay armed and be trained in arms. Just owning arms in your home is not enough. You need to continue to be training. The year 1285, the Statute of Winchester, a really important one. It's a rather long statute. It ordered men in every village, aged 15 to 60, to be armed for defense and keeping of the peace with military weapons of war. The year 1181, and I won't go back further than this, but you get the picture, don't you? The assize of arms of Henry II. All classes of men were to arm themselves with military weaponry. And it was specific again: a shirt of mail, a helmet, a shield, and a lance. And these two could be, the lance could be a weapon of mass destruction in the right hands of someone who's trained with all of his neighbors to go out to war together. Now, when any politician says that military weapons of war have no place in civilian hands, you have to be able to refute that and say why it's not true. Private military-grade weapons are the protectors of liberty and have been since the days of King Alfred and King Canute and King Henry and other good rulers who wanted liberty for their people. Now, the tyrants who wanted something else, who wanted to take liberty away, They always had to first get the weapons out of the hands of the citizenry, and then they had to create permanent government armies. And so the American founders knew this history, that these were the two pillars of liberty. The citizen all must be armed. Okay, do you understand that? No government can build up for itself a standing army and keep a standing army of soldiers who can be turned against the citizens. And so our founders were determined to preserve these lessons, learn from history, learn the hard way, learn the bloody way. Because freedom does rest on the realities of this armed citizenry and the absence of standing armies. Daniel Webster put it this way in the year of the Constitution in 1787. He said this: before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every kingdom of Europe. And that's true. That was even true at that time. It's become even worse now, even in your day. The supreme power in America, meaning the new government that's being formed by this new Constitution, you know, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, the supreme power there cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, meaning by weaponry, because the whole body of the people are armed. And that's how it was then, and that's how it was meant to be. And so disarmament cannot happen. We can't change history, the truths of history. We can't change the meaning and the intent of the framers of the Constitution just because certain tyrannical people want to disarm the people so that they can exert more power over them. So learn your history. Teach it to everyone in your state. And do not let the Bill of Rights be redefined out of existence.